Well, today on the Cameron Journal podcast, we are reaching the firmaments today. We've got a big fish. Ironically, a man who also writes about fish. We are joined today by Paul Greenberg. He is the author most well known for The Climate Diet, 50 Simple Ways to Trim Your Carbon Footprint, and also the author of For Fish, The Future of the Last Wild Food. A lot of people eat fish on this planet. It's incredibly important. But today we're not going to be talking about fish. No, no. Despite the fact he's written for New Yorker, National Geographic, and many other publications, we're actually talking about his new book, A Third Term, which is this really fun novella that posits the idea, what if George Washington came back from the dead and wanted to run against Trump, both looking for a third term that is now constitutionally no longer allowed? Although that was not true when Washington was alive. So, this is going to be a lot of fun. We're probably going to start with some gills related content and then move on to the political fish. So, welcome, Paul, to the Cameron Journal podcast.
Thank you so much, Cameron. Great to be here.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So, I want to start off first by talking. This will be an entree to everything. When it comes to fish and fishing, I will admit I am not outdoorsy. I am indoorsy. I like a nice fish that has been prepared in a lovely restaurant and brought to me on a plate. I
Yeah.
do not understand the obsession with people standing in the water, on the shore, on the boat, trying to catch these with a reel and rod or whatever have you. What is that? Where did your obsession with fish and fishing start from?
I think for me, it's a way of entering into nature in an active way. You spoke of yourself as a great indoorsman.
Yes, yes,
And
exactly.
I think Michael Pollan referred to his father as one of the world's great indoorsmen,
Yes.
which I respect. My father was a great indoorsman. So for me, I am an active kind of person. I'm a big hiker, runner, biker, and I've always loved ecology and I've always loved natural systems. And as a fishing person, you get to kind of enter into those systems as a predator. And in order to catch your prey, you sort of have to understand all of the surrounding things that are going on, whether it's the insects that are hatching out of the stream or the moon phase or the which way the currents are going. So I guess it was sort of a stand-in for kind of the best professor you could possibly imagine,
Hmm.
because you've got this goal to catch the fish, to catch dinner, but there's a huge, sort of very complicated puzzle put in front of you, and so trying to solve that puzzle was sort of my childhood heart's desire.
No, I think that's an excellent way to put it. I do want to ask you right away. This has not gotten any coverage, but I'm sure you've got to be aware of it. The Chinese fishing boats in South America
Mm,
that just seem to be dragging up the whole ocean, like just
yeah.
whatever they can grab, rocks, fish, the Titanic, like like whatever they can get a hold of that fits
Yeah.
in a net, they're just dragging it up. I mean, I'm not, again, not an outdoorsy person, but I've written enough on climate change to know that ecological destruction is irreplaceable.
Yeah. Well, the guy who's doing a lot of good reporting on this is a guy named Ian Urbina, and he has a project called the Outlaw Ocean Project. And he had written for the Times, now he writes for the New Yorker, but
Mhm.
he has a whole kind of tracking of the Chinese fishing fleet. And you're absolutely right. It's the largest fishing fleet in the world, and it's not just South America, it's the entirety of the world. Keep in mind that fishing is often a way of expressing territorial claims. The Chinese have actually built islands from which they are able to,
Yes.
because you own the way that international nautical maritime law works is that you're legally entitled to the ocean 200 nautical miles out from shore. So if you build new shore, you get new ocean.
Yes.
So it's imperialistic ideation combined with food security, which is not unlike we've behaved in the past. Certainly, we've had a distant water fleet, and certainly we have distant water ambitions, as our current president is trying to imply.
Yes.
So fishing and imperialism go hand in hand.
No, absolutely. And I mean, there's also, I mean, history oftentimes mirrors the past. People also forget a lot of the lead up to the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor had to do with economic sanctions,
Yep.
a restriction on the exportation of scrap steel to Japan, and most
Mm,
importantly, we restricted them from importing oil. Japan does not have any; they have to go buy it from someone else. It's part of the
mm,
reason they invaded Manchuria.
mm.
And so I'm being historically read person, being like, very interesting that this
Yeah.
is. Have you read this here? Like it's and also the Japanese and Chinese competition over the Senkaku Islands where no one lives. But yes, when you get into who's shore and the 200 miles around it, then yeah, you end up with the same problem between the United Kingdom and Norway over fishing rights in the North Sea.
Yep.
Like it's yes.
Yep.
So, it's a huge problem. It's a good thing France and Britain don't argue over that in the English Channel because France's territorial boundary would be someplace in Birmingham. So that's no, I mean that's it, it's just the destruction is just tremendous and I mean I agree it's imperialist but I don't know short of starting a war how you even begin to stop that type of climate destruction.
I mean, it kind of goes back, if we could, to transition to, the book on the table, which is a third.
That's why yes, you're right with me.
Um, I mean, it goes down to the question of what is the nation state and what is the goal of nation states in general, and what is our place supposedly as a democracy in this world, where up until recently we at least stood for a notion of fairness and the rule of law. Um, and I think that as we enter into this next phase of American history, and someday it will be history. It just feels like it's in our face 24/7, but someday it will be history. I think it will be looked at as potentially an inflection point when selfishness versus sort of fairness and balance came to rule the day, at least temporarily, we hope. But we'll see.
Yes. Well, why don't we dive right into it then? Tell us a little about third term.
Yeah, sure. Well, so all of these questions had been on my mind, believe it or not, 5 years ago,
Hmm.
during the 2020
Yeah.
election. And I was thinking a lot, as that campaign started gearing up, that so many of sort of what we consider as American values, fairness, rule of law, kindness, hearing the other person speak before we respond. It struck me that all those things were being directly challenged by the convicted felon who currently occupies the White House. And that this was, it suddenly occurred to me that so much of what we consider as sort of core values to being Americans was being rebuffed and thrown out there, that I was like, well, what would happen if George Washington himself was brought back from the past? Would he too find himself in ridiculous arguments, getting his words turned around, getting strange things from his past pulled back and pulled up and thrown up into the campaign? And I thought, yes, that probably would happen. And so what I did was imagined this novella called A Third Term, in which a sort of David Axelrod type, or David Plouffe, if you will, character um, uh, is so frustrated with the Democratic Party that he realizes that there's just nobody on the table that can actually lead. And through the agency of a little bit of sci-fi, George Washington is brought back to this present time and tasked with the job of defeating the tyrant. The person who's currently occupying White House is never called the name that we hear so often in the media. He's only referred to as the tyrant. When Washington awakes, he immediately kind of understands why he's there, and he says, "Has a tyrant arisen?" And the sort of David Axelrod character, whose name is Tonnelly in the book, says, "Yes, yes, he has." And we prefigured as much, George Washington says. So that sets in motion, so I would call it an allegory, a satire. I think it's funny. And, sort of a way of looking at the absurdity of our present political moment through the eyes of a character, George Washington, that we all think we know, but actually don't really know very well at all.
No. I mean, I think the first thing would be like, you're still using the same Constitution after all this time. You just kind of modified it a little bit. Because I mean, Jefferson said new Constitution every 20 years, sort of thing.
Right.
So he'd be shocked about that. And then also kind of like, And we're going to hold your hand while you say this, but you know those black people that you used to own? We've made several updates on that front.
That's right.
Like,
That's right.
brace yourself.
Yeah,
These days, they're running for vice president and president. Like,
that's right. Yeah,
um,
and to be fair to Washington and Jefferson and everyone who, is considered a founding father or sister, these were pretty radical people in their time. And, they overthrew a government and replaced it with one government, and then they replaced that government with another government. So these were not static people who would have sort of endured illogical things. They were children of the literally children of the Enlightenment. They they most of them were deists. They were not religious absolutists. They thought of the God out there as a clockmaker, sort of who wound up the clock and let things spin. But they adhered to logic. They adhered to wanting to have a more rational system, and I think had they sort of heard the blather of the originalists talking about how we have to get back to some like 18th century concept of society, I think they would have, having taken in everything that's changed in this country, I think they would have been pretty perfectly open to having the Constitution and having society evolve.
no, I mean, there was definitely, I mean, especially, in the, we get this kind of luxury because some of them were so young, they were in their 20s, that they lived well into the early decades of the Republic.
Yeah,
And we see even at that stage, things were changing. They didn't necessarily always agree with some of the
yeah,
changes that were happening. People forget there were debates about the Constitution and how it worked had by the people who wrote the damn you
that's
know,
right.
at the
That's right.
time, they're like, that's not what we said at the I remember over tea you specifically said like,
Yeah. I
you
mean,
know,
do you ever have a moment in your life where you say you do something and it sets things in motion and you can't believe that people actually took you seriously? I can't help
yes,
but think that the founders would have had a similar thing. But to your point about slavery, it is a real key point in the book. And I think a lot of people have asked me about this book. Is Washington a real character? Is he real? Or did you mean him to be a real person in this book or just a sort of metaphor? And I kind of wanted him to be both. When you think about what America is, we have all these ideals, we have all of these sort of platitudes that we supposedly lived according to. But at the same time, we're in total denial about all the injustices that brought us to our present moment. And so, what I kind of wanted to do was to take all of that denial and sort of embed it into Washington so that Washington himself is in denial about slavery itself. And so, when
no,
it actually comes up during one of the debates with the tyrant, he suddenly has to kind of have a come to Jesus moment where he reads his own biography and all these things that he thought he had secreted away, the way that he pursued his Hercules who ran away from the household, sent slave catchers after them, the way that Billy Lee, his trusted black servant, had done, literally thrown himself in the path of musket balls, was never freed in the course of Washington's life, though he had full power to do so. So it's a little bit of a construct to make Washington have to look squarely in the face at what he's done. But I think it was kind of meant in the context of a third term, the book, as almost kind of like, what if we could do a little psychotherapy with Washington? What if we actually put him on the couch and confronted him with the reality of the things that he'd done wrong? And then, the result is sort of played out in the plot, which I won't give away.
no, no. I am so glad you've done that. I had an idea several years ago about, I was deep into therapy and doing personal work, and I do a lot of news politics, and I was kind of like, yeah, it would be really cool to do, founders on the couch, what does, what would Thomas Jefferson say in a therapy session sort of thing, and
Yeah, yeah,
it's,
yeah, yeah. That's a good idea.
yeah. So good job. You've done it.
It's funny. My father was a psychiatrist, and he was on. There was a show back in the '90s called Doctor Katz, Professional Therapist, and the concept of that show was that it was Dr. Katz himself was played by a comedian, but he was playing a therapist, and he brought in actual real comedians into the show and had them animated, lying on the couch, and so the therapy routines became almost like stand-up routines. But yeah, I mean, I think people think about the founders a lot. They think about what they would be like. In fact, actually, the other reason a lot of people have asked me with this book, why did you choose to bring Washington back, right? Conceivably, if we're in the realm of science fiction, we could have brought Lincoln back. We could have brought Jefferson back, as you mentioned. But I think what's interesting, so a few years ago, there was a pair of Russian painters who had this idea of could you paint a picture exactly according to a sociological survey of a country? And so they started doing sociological surveys of different countries and then painting accordingly. And when they did the sociological survey of Americans, Americans said that what they liked in a painting was blue, they liked nature, and they liked to have a founding father, preferably Washington. And then they produced this painting, and you can find it online. It's this incredibly sort of anodyne, boring painting of a riverfront and Washington and a deer. And I
Yeah.
think, I think that's the thing is that the other thing is, of course, I'm trying to sell this book both to left and right, red and blue, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that in a way, if you put Washington into a book, the right can't look away. And so it was a little bit going back to our fishing metaphor. It was bait on the hook to try and catch as many fish as possible.
Well, and I think the other and excellent ideas there. I think the other half of that is we have a lot of mythology about these people now.
Yeah.
And I think people don't understand and especially it kicks into high gear at the beginning of the Cold War.
Hmm.
CIA, other agencies are kind of like, oh, we need, to stave off communism, to stave off socialism, Red Scare, all this type of thing. We need to really enforce this pro-America message. And so they kind of dig into the annals and history of the country and create this mythology about, the founding fathers and capitalism and freedom and all these sort of marquee concepts that we now readily associate with ourselves and our country and all this type of thing. And I think people would be shocked. And there's not very many people old enough to remember the time before that. But
Mm,
my Nana was in high school in the 50s and kind
mm.
of remembers how that started, sort of
Yeah.
thing. And there was all this, especially coming out of the war, all this media produced around this thing. And I think, especially on the right, I find, and I grew up a Republican. My parents are three-time Trump voters.
Yeah.
Um, as a young, evangelical homeschooled kid, these were mythical, almost magical men who
Yeah.
created this country thing. And the people don't realize in the right, especially in like homeschooling evangelical church, really the core of the Republican base, is these men are revered as demigods. The mythology around them is tremendous. And
Yeah.
one of the things I found when I went to college and started engaging with the left is the founders lose all their magic in among moderates, and by the time you get to the left, it is gone. The conversations you have about the founding fathers on the left are, yeah, our country was founded by slave owners, so
Yeah.
that's a problem.
Yeah. Yeah, but it's funny you should bring that up. When I first wrote A Third Term, as I mentioned, I wrote it for going on 5 years ago,
Right,
and the book landed on my agent's desk literally as Black Lives Matters was at full pitch.
right.
And my agent said to me, "I don't think America is really wants to talk about George Washington right now." And I understand that, but I think this is a moment where you know the left's complete dismissal of the founders is a
Yes.
problem. Because as I mentioned earlier, these were interesting, intelligent, radical people
Mhm.
of their time. Um, Opportunistic, surely. Property owners, people owners for sure. But to dismiss everything about them is to dismiss the fact that they did something life risking and brave in throwing off an empire that was trying to dictate their day to day. Now, they might have been doing it for economic reasons, But as Obama would say, the path of or the arc of history is long. I guess he was quoting Martin Luther King, but the arc of
Yeah.
history is long. And if you think about the arc as of America as the inciting throwing off of shackles for economic reasons, then there becomes this whole arc of throwing off shackles that I think potentially, could be interesting. It was interesting. My son a couple of years ago was studying for the AP European history exam, and I'd taken that whatever 30 years ago. And I never really could understand. Do you remember like European history, like how your teachers get really bogged down in the Protestant Reformation, and they show you I remember my AP exam very very well. There's like a gold ornate Catholic cross, and then there's this very spare wooden Protestant cross, right? And the
Yeah.
essay was explained. And at the time, it was just a sort of, you know, debate about, you know, liturgy and how you would interpret the religious experience personally and so forth. But keep in mind that those, to us, seemingly small differences set off like wars that went on for decades. And the
130 years.
yeah. And the reason that happened is because what was really being challenged was the primacy of the Catholic Church's ability to control the human mind. And so by Martin Luther putting up those theses on that door, he basically said the monopoly on the human mind is over. And we are going to open the door to all kinds of thinking. So, of course, Martin Luther would have never embraced the Enlightenment. That wasn't, the idea of God as a clockmaker was not cool with Martin Luther. He was a liturgist. He was a, anti-Semite. He was like very, very, you know, from that period from which he came. But I suddenly realized as I was studying with my son is that without the Reformation, there could have never been any scientific revolution, right?
Oh,
Without
yeah,
piercing that
yes.
armor of the Catholic Church, you
Yep.
could never have the opening of free thought the way that we'd had. So I suddenly was like, oh,
No, there is a very specific through line from Protestant Reformation, the rise of literacy, Enlightenment.
yeah,
What I think is interesting is how much of, in a weird way, especially the Northern Renaissance, you can kind of say, through Protestant Reformation, literacy, the Northern Renaissance, Enlightenment as well. The Southern Renaissance, much, much less so because it was controlled and dominated by the Catholic Church. Great art, but controlled by the Catholic Church. No, I mean, sort of thing. And also from the Enlightenment and the embrace of reason, not only do you get the age of science, you also get industrialization
right, of course,
sort
yes,
of thing.
yep,
And so and it's in a weird way, even though it's only been 500 years, we're still kind of living in the shadow of all of that, you
absolutely,
know. And
absolutely.
even in this country, I'm old enough to remember when, it was controversial for Protestant and the Catholic got married. That wasn't that long ago. One of my favorite books of all time, Truman Capote in Cold Blood, that was remarked that the daughter that was killed in that book, her boyfriend was Catholic and the father wanted her to not date him anymore. Those were one of the personal things I found about that family. It was a very odd sort of odd sort of thing. But we do, to bring it back around though, we do live in these stories, don't we?
Yes.
And I think one of the things I think is fascinating about this book that I really like, and something I've encouraged because I've talked about, we've been living in this narrative and it's kind of coming to an end. Trump is not the disease, he's a symptom of the white Christian heteronormative narrative is coming to an end.
Mm.
America's looking different. This is the extinction burst. This is the symptom, not the disease. We live in these stories, and these sometimes mythologies. Um, what do you One of the things I kind of like about this book is I was kind of rewriting that story. What about kind of diving into putting Washington in a modern context changed the story you had in your head about him?
Yeah, well, first of all, I mean, on a lighthearted way, um, after doing the research on it, I didn't realize to what a degree Washington was a slave of fashion and literally a clothes horse. One of the reasons he was in such huge debt was that he was constantly ordering clothes and fashionable things like carriages from Europe. So that was pretty interesting. But the other thing, the larger picture, and what I learned in the course of the research was how much debt itself played a factor in his political decisions, even his decision, I think, to break away from England. He was facing huge debt as a plantation owner, even though he was very land rich, but very cash poor. And he was really kind of in a noose, and he had to kind of keep moving forward. And that was a real motivating factor. Having been in debt in the course of my life, I really, truly understand that. But I think, you know, the thing that I think I tried to kind of excavate from it all was that ultimately you can say what you will about Washington, but I don't believe there's any doubt that he was an extremely personally brave person. When he charged into battle uh, in the French Indian War at the Battle at the Ohio Forks against the French, something that was memorialized, you might recall, in the musical Hamilton.
Mhm.
When he came back from that charge, his tunic was literally full of musket ball holes. He really dived right into danger. And I think what is really kind of missing in leadership at the present time in this country is kind of just a lack of just bald-faced courage, you know? And I think that allows the present occupant of the White House to talk courageously, but if you look at his actual record, dodging the draft through, through his bone spurs and so forth, that there's no actual center of courage, center of strength in that person. So I guess if there's like one takeaway, and I'm sorry, Cameron, I've drifted far from your question, but if there's one takeaway that I would like people to see in this book is that leadership requires real character,
Mhm.
that developing leadership is hard, that leading is hard, and that all these three things combined are contributing to a crisis in leadership in this country that we have at the present time. So whether we're
Yeah.
wiping the slate clean or not, of the founding fathers, it remains the problem that we need leaders in this country, and leaders who lead not out of a desire to boost their own egos or their bank accounts, but who truly feel that their leadership can improve the condition of Americans.
Well, and two, I think that's an excellent point about the story of Washington, how motivated he was by different factors. But I think also, and people also forget, he actually came from very little. He married into money by marrying the wealthy Martha Curtis. Whose husband had conveniently died.
Yeah.
And I do love the fact that he was kind of a bit of a bit of fashionable. It's like we founded the first modern democratic republic and looked great while doing it. And but I don't think any of us realized. I certainly didn't fully realize how much of our stability of government was dependent on the character of the people in office. I kind of always laugh. If you had told any of us in 2006 we would look fondly upon the Bush years, particularly liberal people, we would have laughed in your face. We thought that was the low. We have
Right,
reached the
right.
bottom, the absolute minimum we could go. We can only go up from here. And like the old Soviet joke, there was a knock from below, and it came from Donald Trump. And
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
but I mean, institutions in any government is only as good as the people that are in it. But I don't think people realized even a lot of the stuff we took for granted, the stuff we thought were norms, the stuff we thought would never change, was really only there because the previous occupants weren't brave enough and or legally bold enough to go around and just do whatever they wanted, sort of thing.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, like look at
and
what
relied upon people in consensus to keep things going. Trump does not care about any of those things. And I think that's has always been the real danger.
yeah, and you something you mentioned at the top of the show, which is that Washington didn't serve a third term in his era, not because he was constitutionally forbidden to do so, but
Mhm.
because he didn't want to, and because he saw it as necessary for the Republic to voluntarily step down and let elections take place. He didn't have to do that. Everyone in his cabinet and a vast majority of Americans probably wanted him to stay and keep running, but he didn't do it. Now, cut ahead to 2025, where we have an occupant of the White House, convicted felon, who continues to drop the suggestion that there are ways for him to somehow obviate the Constitution and serve a third term. The 22nd Amendment, of course, forbids that, and that didn't happen until 19, I think, 51. And it was, a direct result of FDR seeking not just a third, but a fourth term,
Mhm.
and getting it. But to me, another reason is why I decided to call this book a third term is because, in a way, this seeking out of a third term is a metaphor for all of the unconstitutional things that this present regime represents. And the third term is just a cherry on top. There's so many things in the Constitution and in our democratic tradition that don't allow the kind of executive action that's taking place right now. So if we can draw our attention and just focus on the fact that we can't allow a third term, which is a very real possibility, I think everything unconstitutional underneath that premise will hopefully come to light.
No, I mean, I think that's very, very a very kind of vital discussion that's happening, and I think there's competing. I think it's honestly the cherry on top of something that's very important. I was reading a tweet this morning, and this guy said, I voted for, Trump to make the left no longer a cohesive political force in this country.
Mm-hmm.
And I saved that because when people say that in December, when I said this is a retreat, this is a surrender and retreat by the entire, Democratic Party and any sort of leftism, even milquetoast liberal, moderate leftism in this country. And everyone thought I was crazy and being an alarmist and all this sort of thing. And I want to haul this out and be kind of like I mean,
Voila.
is it like I think they're people don't people just don't. I'm like, no, it's like no, 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 no. This is a complete. We're waving the white flag and retreating. And I always laugh at people kind of like, where are the Democrats? Why aren't they doing anything? I'm like, well, first of all, the election was in November. November 5th was your day to have that option. And her name was Kamala. You could have voted for her. But also, too, I said, you don't understand. He's won the Electoral College. He's won the popular vote. The percentages weren't great, but he's taken everything this time. This is clearly what the American people want. This is a retreat and surrender.
Yeah,
What the package of goods the Democratic Party has sold for the last decade or so is not of interest. It's going to be a retreat. And I think it's, kind of interesting how nobody seems to understand, like even with the going after colleges and universities, that's to get rid of bastions of left-wing power. Going after
absolutely.
aspects of the government, same situation. It's to undo any sort of organizational, professional, institutional viability of a certain political spectrum, a certain political view, and to either co-opt those institutions, which the GOP's wanted to do since the 70s. That's not even new. That's an old
Yeah,
thing. Or to end them entirely,
yeah,
so that you don't have those as centers of power, weight, fundraising, producing professionals, good people, all this type of thing. And so in this way, if you kind of look at it from that perspective, this is a generational presidency. This is
mhm,
something the effects of which people will write books about 20 years from now.
for sure.
PhD students will do graduate work on this, maybe not in this country, but they'll do it somewhere else, sort of thing. I mean,
Yeah,
and so I think it's but to circle back to about Washington, the fact that people literally he could have declared himself king and people would have signed up, be like, oh yes, the new King Washington,
yeah,
exactly, and Queen Martha, we heart you, like, sort of thing. And he said, no, we need to get used to and in the practice of orderly changes of power.
that's
So
right.
guess what, we're gonna do our first one, climb on board, everybody, sort of thing.
Yeah,
um
yeah, and when we were talking earlier about that break with empire that the United States made through its revolution being a kind of a first part of an arc, you can look at the distribution of power in that original government between three branches as a an acknowledgement that power should be separated, siloed, so that no single person can get a hold of it. I think that philosophy governed the spread of educational institutions, the proliferation of educational institutions, even
Certainly.
our style of management. I don't know if this came through in the biography I sent you, but so I spent a long time working in the former Soviet Union, right after the fall of communism, and I worked for, believe it or not, a USAID funded nonprofit that
Yes.
past month went from $100 million organization to a $0 organization, was completely shuttered. But my job was to go all over the former Soviet Union, finding independent television stations that had appeared towards the end of communism and training them and helping them become news gathering institutions that would allow a free flow of information. What was really interesting, one of the biggest, and the project worked, by the way. It was doing really well. We had something like, we worked with 300 stations all over the former Soviet Union. All that was shut down by Putin, of course. But one of the biggest problems that we found, it wasn't lack of enthusiasm, it wasn't journalistic acumen, it was that there was no middle management in any of these TV stations. There was just the director and a bunch of serfs. And this country is different.
Typical Russian way of doing things.
Yeah, but I mean, this country is different, right? Like we actively encourage the development of incremental managerial skills, and that distribution of power makes a much more sound institution overall, right? If you have lots of people who, in a pinch, could step in and take over or exceed to a higher level, that makes for a much more stable business, government, state government, local government, whatever you want to say. Yeah. And the present administration is all against that. And so when you talk about a generational change that we're facing, I think we all hope that our children, certainly I hope my children, will have a place in middle class society. But to quote Blade Runner, I don't know if you're familiar with that movie, but at one point the police chief says to Decker, he says, "Come on, Decker, you know the score. You're either cop or you're little people." And that's the thing. You're either a powerful oppressor or you're nothing. And that's the system that I think the present occupant of the White House would like to see put in place. And that's the thing that we're fighting against. And I think that's something that Washington himself was opposed to. I think he wanted to see a distribution of power, of intelligence, and of agency throughout the
At least among white-owning males, yes. White landowning males, yes.
Yes. Full disclosure, yes, true.
Yes, yes. So how should be divided? At least among white landowning males.
And so, but one thing to point out,
more diffuse than Britain, though. I mean,
yes. But I don't know if you ever saw or listened to the musical Hamilton, but if and people who read this book will see traces of it scattered throughout, because my son basically grew up with Hamilton, and so it was always in the CD player, when we were driving anywhere. But there's that great moment when Washington and Hamilton have that duet in the second act. And he says, "I want to live under my own vine and fig tree." And that's how he would like to live out his retirement. But that line actually comes from an address that Washington made to a synagogue in Newport. And it's very interesting, right? Like that Washington would address a synagogue. Now, of course, I'm a little biased. I am Jewish, though not particularly believing. But Jews were not necessarily a welcome presence in the colonies, but that he would make a statement to a group that was not in line with the sort of dominant philosophy speaks to, I think, a potential inclusiveness that the government was intended to have. So I don't know. Yeah. I mean, yes, slave owners, white guy, oppressor in his own way. But as I say, I think there's filigree and evidence of a future tolerance.
No, that was also true of other religious groups, particularly John Adams and Jefferson. Both are on the record. Jefferson, was definitely. He would look at the duplicitousness of our religious thing and be like, yes, this is exactly what we intended for anyone of every religion to come here and be able to worship freely with no state interference. That's probably one of their goals we have achieved. No other nation on earth has done what we have done on that end of things.
Yeah.
Which I think they would very much welcome. And Jefferson even, mentioned the importance of having, as he put it, Mohammedans, but is Muslims. That was the 18th century term, Mohammedans, Muslims involved as a part and parcel of American society. I think they'd be very pleased because we did that and we did it really well, and we taught the world how not to have a state religion, how to have a society without a state religion.
That's right. Which goes back to what we were talking about earlier earlier about the breakup of the Catholic Church during the Reformation. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's the logical extension of that. And I will say that Washington, he was a believer, but he also, I think, he saw in faith of any kind um, a organizing aegis, some sort of way to organize society so that people and a moral code. And I think it's hard to have a society without a moral code.
It
You need
is, yeah.
some levels of some institutional way of recognizing respect, of tolerance, of love.
No, and and I think also the kind of the other half of that, I think the more difficult half of that, is that you end up you end up with different power centers, people finding community, all this type of thing. And that, I think in the past, and I think this is one of the things Trump wants to get rid of, and certainly Silicon Valley tech bros want to get rid of, and I'm coming back to that, is you end up with different people in different centers and weights of power, which means if you want to be able to do policy, you have to have consensus. You have to bring people together. You have to, engage with groups, institutions, citizen advocate, all this type of thing to make something happen. And that means your policy and slogans is going to have a lot of influence, and people are going to need to be able to, be comfortable signing on with at least most or some of what you're proposing, rather than just simply articulating a vision, expecting it to be followed. And I
Okay.
think for the Silicon Valley tech bros, and I think why they pivoted to Trump in 24 is he offers them a vision of what they've always wanted. I think, and someone put it very beautifully. They said, the left is mad that they don't get paid for the social good they do. The right is mad they don't get the social credit for the money they have. And I think Silicon Valley was like, wouldn't the world be better if we could run it like a startup?
Yeah.
Wouldn't the world be better if we could run it like we do things here? And so rather than our historic centers of power being in banking or agriculture or industry, it's now shifted west and to digital.
Yeah.
And I think the interesting, aspect of that is Silicon Valley is one giant Ayn Randian sort of paradise. Everyone's running around asking who is John Galt. It's great. And I think for them, it's a matter of society's too messy. We don't want to get consensus. We don't want to talk to people. We don't want to work with others. We don't want to watch our good ideas get blended through public wisdom and discourse. We want to top down, like a giant press hammer, just reshape the country the way we think it should be like.
Yeah.
And here
Or,
comes Trump saying, hey, yeah, sounds great. When do we start? And Elon Musk is like, let me cut you a check for 270 million and we'll get to work.
but I mean, I think also it's instructive to note that a lot of the people who are in management or in ownership in Silicon Valley came out of coding, and in coding,
Mm,
your goal is to make the most efficient code, and
right.
so some sort of evil stew has taken place whereby they consider this kind of CEO concept the most efficient code for running a government. But as I
Yes.
wrote in a recent essay, there's no mistake, there's no coincidence that people refer to Stalin as Khazyain, the boss. And he was the CEO of his corporation, which was called the Soviet Union. But
Yeah.
the problem is, first of all, in a real corporation, there are members of the board. There are shareholders that can dump the stock at any time. I don't see this developing into that kind of framework. I think the boss will stay the boss. There will be no board of directors that can hire and fire the CEO, and the shareholders, that is, we the people, are getting disenfranchised institution by institution to the point where we will eventually lose our inability to dump the shares of the corporation, which is, i.e., change the government. So, the metaphor doesn't work. The code doesn't work. It's inefficient, and pretty soon, people like Mark Andreessen and all those other jerk offs who went in this direction are going to see that they made a very bad mistake, and that it's not going to be this sort of, as you said, Ayn Randian paradise of the beautifully run corporation, but a failed and corrupt state.
Well, yes, and I think, I always, and it's a very sobering moment, and some people kind of made fun of me, but I said right after the election, I said there's a couple realities I've had to get used to. One, I never thought I'd live in a country where by doing this job, i.e. journalism, my life would be in danger, but that's now a reality I have to live with now. This
Yeah.
job comes with danger. Every time I press record and put stuff out and I say things against this, the reality is I could, be imprisoned or killed, and I've had to become used to that, and I'm trying to soldier onward regardless.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, good for you.
Um,
And I say good for you and good for everybody who at this point doesn't respond to their inner feeling of fear. And I think, if you look at any oppressive autocratic system, it's always a minority of people who control the majority. And that happens through cajoling and through fear and through acquiescence. And so God bless you, to keep doing what you're doing and to do it with courage and not shying away from, from putting important things out there.
No, thank you. And the other kind of half of that sort of thing is what I will always worry about. And you kind of we always used to joke, when would be the time to leave and how bad does it get? And we've had to start very seriously having that conversation now.
Yeah.
Is also the amount of people who, because of the pulling of government funding or visa issues or immigration issues, the amount of knowledge and smart scientists and researchers and projects and all this type of thing that we are losing, we won't recover from that for decades. I
Yeah.
mean, you have, European countries openly opening up visa programs to bring people over. I was literally watching a 60 Minutes, and it was an American researcher, and they said, who's doing research in Canada because this person has had to leave.
Yeah.
And I mean, if you told any of us in 1995 this is your future in
Yeah.
30
Yeah.
years, we would have laughed in your face and said, no, that will never, look around you. That will never happen here. All this sort of thing. And I think one of the horrors of all of this, um, and this kind of gets back into what the founding fathers in Washington feared. I think one of the horrors is the wolf of tyranny is never far from the door.
Yeah.
The founding fathers understood that very, very well. And in the intervening 200 and almost 50 years, we kind of forgot.
Yep.
And here it is back again. And so I think Washington would be kind of like, we gave you the Second Amendment. Where's your well-organized militia? What, like, where are they? And can you call them so I can lead them into battle? Like, like
Maybe, maybe. But I mean, I think also, I think he would be disappointed at the way that the distributed powers under a single party that has acquiesced to the will of a tyrant um, have basically um, reneged on their own responsibilities to run this government responsibly. So, when historians write the history, it won't just be about one person taking power. It's going to be about a lot of people giving it to him ultimately.
I mean, really, I mean, the story of Trump is the abdication of the Republican Party to anything other than him in
Yep.
their own quest for power. And I think that's, a quite difficult and dangerous thing. And I feel like even someone like Hamilton, who was a little cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs, um, understood the gravity of running a society,
Yeah.
of building a country, sort of thing.
Yep.
Um, and if that's kind of one thing that I think is so missing from today's politics is, and when you get to the CEO thing, they want to, America. We talk about America Inc., China Inc., Japan Inc., and a lot of Asian countries have these very kind of top down sort of things, and someone like Singapore have been very successful, trying very successful, all this sort of thing. But they don't understand that America Inc. doesn't include just them and the people that work for them and do that type of work. It also includes the guy doing HVAC repair in Denison, Iowa. It
Yeah.
includes the fish writer. It includes the podcaster. We're all part of America Inc. too. And I think the part that annoys me the most about that is they seem to forget that we all live here too.
Yep. Yep.
You
Yep.
know?
Yep. Absolutely. And, again, going back to the kind of quest for scientific truth and for rationality and so forth, the path to a perfect society and a society with good science and good rules is littered with mistakes, false starts, backtracking. Um, and what we've created up until now is a society that, while full of intolerance, has enough tolerance to let inquiry play out. Um, and let us learn what we don't know. Let us make mistakes. Let us learn from our mistakes. That's ultimately an evolutionary society that gets better and better. And what we have here is a fork in the road where we have to decide, are we an evolutionary society that the founding fathers set us forward with from an age of enlightenment, from the dawn of enlightenment, or are we going to be a backwards place where we're just the will of a single person, determines everything, and inquiry comes to a halt?
Yeah, and I think that's an excellent point to end. We're almost at the top of the hour.
Yeah.
I try to keep these down to an hour because people short attention spans.
Understood.
And it's a nice length. When I first started, I always tell people, I said, take me with you to work. I'm either the length of a long commute or you can listen in two halves for a short commute. So and I still do that even though I don't really talk about that anymore. But it's a great time for plugs. So why don't you tell us where we can find you online and where we can find the book?
Sure. If you go to paulgreenberg.org, that's BERG at the end of Greenberg, paulgreenberg.org, you'll see a link to all of my books, including A Third Term. And Third Term, you can just plug A Third Term into Amazon. It'll come right up. You can get it in Kindle or paperback. I do try to steer people toward independent booksellers if possible, because I really do believe that those are going to be the engine of democracy in the years ahead. So you'll see links to different individual booksellers. You can also go to bookshop.org and order the book that way. So whatever way you get it, would love to hear from readers, and they can get in contact with me through the paulgreenberg.org website.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for coming on the Cameron Journal podcast.
I really appreciate it, Cameron. Great questions, great conversation.
That's all for this episode of the Cameron Journal podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Visit us online at CameronJournal.com. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and I love to talk to my followers and listeners, so please feel free to get us on social media at Cameron Cowan on Twitter, and we'll see you next time on the Cameron Journal podcast.